Hi, everybody. This is Professor Chima. Let's go ahead and talk about the Odyssey today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can talk about the PowerPoint. All right. So the Odyssey is one of the most powerful and most memorable epic poems in world literature, as is attested by the numerous times it's been adapted in popular culture, books, films, TV, and the like. And there are obviously many, many examples of this, but here I have a couple of stills from the two-part made-for-TV miniseries starring Armand Assante in 1997. And this is actually the version that we're going to be watching after we finish our reading of the Odyssey. So I want us to also have a common definition of what an epic poem is and how does the Iliad and the Odyssey fit within that particular genre. So epic poems are long narrative poems featuring one or more hero, and they're characterized by marvelous adventure and bravery. So, just as a way to contrast it, for instance, so against the epic, usually scholars contrast the genre of romance. So, for instance, when we think of, stories like the famous Greek romance of Heliodorus, Aethiopica, which is about a wandering pair of lovers traveling over the seas, just having adventures and overcoming many trials until they're able to be together and have a happy ending. That is the format, the classical format for a romance. But epic poems are more about just warfare, bravery, adventures, and it's a very masculine genre generally. Even though obviously with the Iliad and the Odyssey, we can see that there are many, many memorable female characters, but in general, it tends to be a more of a masculine martial genre. So, as I've mentioned, the Iliad and the Odyssey are epic poems about the Trojan War, composed, or so we think, by a blind Greek poet called Homer. So scholars aren't sure if Homer is an actual person. It's quite possible that these poems were composed by multiple people over a certain span of time. But in any case, they're attributed to this very enigmatic figure called Homer, and so we'll kind of take that as a fact going forward, even though there's still debate about it. So these two poems are composed late 8th century or early 7th century BCE, but they describe events that take place a lot earlier, from approximately 12th century to 13th century BCE. So there's a considerable gap of centuries between when the events of the Trojan War took place and when these poems were composed. These two poems belong to the traditions of oral poetry. So a lot of even though we're reading them as prose, as print, but they're really meant to be recited aloud, and that's exactly how they were transmitted. They were recited aloud and performed by actors. And so a lot of the rhythmic quality of the language really comes from its roots as oral poetry, as something that's meant to be sung and performed. These two poems are incredibly memorable because they show these really epic, larger than life themes, such as a clash of civilizations, the incredible importance of family and kinship, and we can see this in the Odyssey, right? We have a man at the start of the poem sitting on a rock, staying with a beautiful nymph called Calypso, but looking out over the sea, weeping for his home and for his family. So again, this incredible pull towards family and home really connects all these adventures together in the struggle of a man trying to get home. Another important theme is the effects of war on both winners and losers. And so I think these poems are incredibly memorable for this reason, or at least this is one of the reasons why we remember it. And it's because it's not really a us versus them, good versus bad story, right? If you have read the Iliad, or if you have a chance to read the Iliad, you actually end up feeling a lot more sympathy and connection with the Trojan characters, with people like Hector and his wife Andromache and Hecuba, Priam, like all these amazing, wonderful characters. And so even though the heroes are obviously the Greeks in this story, this is a Greek narrative, right? But at the same time, we get this kind of empathy and sympathy and identification with the other. So we can see, right, that the war is incredibly complex, cultural contact is incredibly complex. And so the poem is really amazing, I think, in showing these multiple facets of that experience. With the Odyssey in particular, some important themes are heroism, right? And we'll talk about what kind of hero Odysseus stacks up to be. We'll talk about the aftermath of war. This particular poem begins en media res, or in the middle of the story, right? And the events, but we get a long flashback sequence where Odysseus recounts what happens in the Trojan War. So really the whole poem and Odysseus's journey back home is shaped by the aftermath of war and the impact of war, right? As I've discussed, it has flashbacks. Another important theme is the voyage home. And then finally, survival. The Odyssey is memorable because it's a poem about survival. How do you survive? What kind of qualities does it take for a hero to survive? So, just a fun fact, for many years, scholars debated about whether the Trojan War was an actual event or not. Was it something fictional that Homer composed, or did it actually happen? And are these poems ways of memorializing this particular historical event? And so, as it turns out, it is a historical event. Some great military confrontation did take place between, city-states in the Greek, Turkish part of the Mediterranean Sea. And so there are actual Trojan ruins at the city of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. So here I have a couple of pictures that archaeologists have excavated regarding those ruins, right? We can see the amphitheater, right? We can see kind of these ruins of houses. We can see a temple ruin. So yes, indeed, the city of Troy did in fact exist, and the Trojan War did take place. So I'm going to come back to the theme that I just mentioned, which is about survival, right? And so when we think about the Iliad versus the Odyssey, we are to some degree contrasting the heroes around whose personalities these two epic poems revolve. And so if the Odyssey is shaped by not only Odysseus' journey but also his personality, then the Iliad is shaped by the personality and the story of its primary protagonist, which is Achilles. And so I think these two men really kind of, I think contrasting them and seeing their qualities is a way of distinguishing between these two epic poems. Whereas Achilles is an incredible warrior. He's undefeated in battle. He's the fastest. He's the strongest. You cannot defeat him in military combat. Um, and on the other hand, Odysseus, even though he's clearly an excellent warrior, he really isn't, as a hero, distinguished by just excellence in that particular field. What really characterizes him is the fact that he's incredibly intelligent. He's incredibly persuasive. He's strategic. He wins through persuasion and by strategy and using his mind. And so, again, I think these two qualities are ways of contrasting the heroes. And some scholars have said that even though Achilles is incredibly heroic and we conventionally value these aspects of a hero being very strong, being very brave, being matchless in battle, these are actually not the qualities which ensure survival, right? Because Achilles does get killed in the middle of the Trojan War. It's in fact deception and trickery and rhetoric and persuasion and just being cunning and having all these using your wits in these difficult situations. Those are the qualities which ensure survival and return home. So, as I've mentioned, the Odyssey is incredibly influential. It has impacted so many incredible works of art over the centuries, and there's no way that I would have time to cover all of them. But as a snapshot of just a couple of recent adaptations that I find pretty intriguing, we can talk about James Joyce's modernist novel Ulysses, which he published in 1922 about a group of literary, writers and publishers in early 20th century Dublin and Ireland. And so the themes of the Odyssey get reworked in very incredibly complex and moving ways. We can also think about graphic novels, right? Gareth Hines' graphic novel, The Odyssey, a graphic novel, which he published in 2010, is a great example of that. I really love this. I think so many of the images are just so incredible, and there's such wonderful visual recreations of the stories and adventures that we know and love so well. I love the cover, right? I think this image of Odysseus battling the elements, battling these incredible challenges, it's really symbolized very powerfully, right, by this image of Poseidon kind of popping out of the sea and just again staring at this raft of a man, just battling the elements on his own and his desire to get back home. Another book that I can recommend is Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad. And as you can tell from the title, that this is a retelling of the Odyssey from the perspective of Penelope, Odysseus's wife. And just Atwood does really incredible, just fantastic things with the story in terms of telling it from a feminist perspective. And then finally, Batman. I think that DC's baddest, DC Comics favorite hero, Batman, right? And so, well, he's actually my favorite hero from the DC Comics series. So his personality is actually inspired to a large degree by Odysseus, by a hero like Odysseus. So if we contrast a hero like Superman, right, with Batman, I think this contrast between Achilles and Odysseus really plays out, in this kind of modern superhero retelling, right? So whereas Superman is incredibly powerful and just physically strong, Batman doesn't win his battles that way. He wins by his intelligence, his cunning, his research, right? And so those are things I think which we can also see in Odysseus. So, I also want to talk about some core cultural themes and concepts about the ancient Greek world that are going to help you understand the setting and the language of the Odyssey a little bit more. And so, one concept that I want to go over is that of the oikos, right? And so, when I say oikos, I don't mean a delicious yogurt. I actually mean the Greek household, right? And so when you travel with Odysseus in the world of the Odyssey, you are going to find these really amazing households slash palaces slash administrative units, which are basically oikoi, right? And so, King Alcinous's palace in Phaeacia is a really good example of that. Odysseus's palace, when we get to Ithaca, is also a good example of that. And so, in the ancient Greek world, the household was a fundamental social, political, and economic unit, right? And so, the Greek culture, again, just revolves around the oikos. And so, it's determined by kinship and marriage, right? So, the core members of the oikos are those that are of blood descent, the core family, the core aristocratic or royal family, right? Um, or those who marry in. So, for instance, when we get to Ithaca, and as we've been seeing, as we track the journey home with Odysseus, the tension in Ithaca is that Penelope, obviously, it's her palace. She is the queen of Ithaca. It's the palace, this beautiful palace with its furniture and its wealth that she commands, right, it's her place, it's her home, but she's a married in, and so there's this pressure for her to remarry, right? And so is the married in, does she belong to the same level as somebody of blood descent, right? This is Telemachus's inheritance. So we can see that this tension sort of play out, um and really shape ideas of kinship and marriage in the ancient Greek world. The oikos is patrilineal, right? So this household, the central household, is transmitted from father to son, and we can see that with this Telemachus stating his rights over the suitor, saying that no, I am the heir to this property. Stop devouring all my wealth. So there is a core part of the oikos, which is a nuclear family. So, for instance, in Phaeacia, we can see King Alcinous, Queen Arete, Nausicaa, right? These are the core members of the Oikos, and then you have other members, sort of like um, that are part of it, kind of in concentric circles, in the model of concentric circles going outward, you have important slaves, right? Slaves who've been working with the family for a long time and who have become almost part of the family to the service. You did have slavery in the ancient Greek world, right? And you also have extended family members, right, who kind of come in for parties or events or other occasions, or who could actually live there on a more permanent basis if they had no other means of support. And then you also have visiting friends, right? People who drop in, people who kind of stay there and enjoy the hospitality and then just kind of go their way. And we actually didn't read that part of the book because it gets cut out of the Norton edition for conciseness. But when Telemachus leaves Ithaca to voyage outward to get news of his father, he goes to the house of the king of Sparta, Menelaus, and Queen Helen, Helen of Troy, right, who has returned with her husband back to Sparta. And we can see him, just receive this really lavish hospitality as a son of his co-warrior and of his friend Odysseus, right? Menelaus and Helen really lavish, the hospitality upon Telemachus. So again, that is like the setting of the Oikos. I think King Alcinous's palace is just a fabulous example of that, right? And so I'm just going to read parts of the description just to give you a sense of place and space and, how kinship and things like labor work with this particular concept. So let's read over it together. The palace of the mighty king was high and shone like rays of sunlight or of moonlight. The walls were bronze all over, and along them ran a frieze of blue. Gold doors held safe the house. Pillars of silver rose up from the threshold, the lintel silver, and the handle gold. At intervals were seats set in the walls right from the doorway to the inner rooms, with soft embroidered throws, the work of women. The king had 50 slave girls in his house. Some ground the yellow grain upon the millstone. Others wove cloth and sat there spinning yarn. Outside the courtyard by the doors there grew orchard of 4 acres, hedged around. The trees are tall, luxuriant with fruit, bright-colored apples, pears, and pomegranate. A fertile vineyard, too, is planted there. There are 2 springs, one flows all through the garden, and the other gushes from the courtyard threshold towards the palace, and the people draw fresh water. So, the final thing I'll mention about this concept is that the oikos is intended to be a self-enclosed unit, right? It grows a large portion of its own food, right? You have herds, for of cattle and goats for meat. You have orchards for fruit. You have some agriculture, right? And so it has its own access on source of water, right? As we can see in this particular description. You have its own labor force that is making its own cloth, that is making its own right products that it needs for the daily household life. And so yeah, it's its own unit. So if you ever had to go off the grid, this would be the way to go, right? This would definitely be the way to go. Something that I do also want to mention about the Odyssey is that it's important to pay attention to not just what Homer is describing, the content of the story, right? But also how he describes. So, as I mentioned, the Odyssey is a work of oral poetry in the fact that it's composed orally and transmitted orally for many, many years until it starts getting written down. And you have to pay attention to the qualities of the language to really get the unique feel and the artistry, right, of this particular epic poem. So I want to go over a couple of literary devices with you and also ask you to pay attention to these devices as you go reading the poem. The first one is characterization, and characterization is the act of creating and describing characters in literature. So this includes personal characteristics, right, how a person looks, as well as moral, ethical, personality attributes. So there are 2 types of characterization. The first is direct characterization, where the author spells it out for you, such as, cunning Odysseus, or wily Odysseus, or intelligent Odysseus, things like that, or indirect, right? And so that is showing and not telling. When the writer shows you how the characteristics of a person. And so one of my favorite examples of indirect characterization is when Odysseus has washed ashore to Phaeacia. And obviously, he's exhausted. He's stained with salt with the sea. He's probably starving, thirsty, just completely exhausted, and at the end of his physical limits in a way, right? I mean, he survived a stormy ocean, the wrath of Poseidon, and has just barely landed in Phaeacia. And so he hides in a bush, right? Because he doesn't want his body exposed to the elements and getting attacked by a stranger or an animal, which again shows his incredible intelligence. Like he doesn't fall to pieces. He's able to keep it together, and seek shelter for his sleep. And then the next morning, when Nausicaa and her friends are out there washing their clothes, he's like, oh hey, these are these, young girls out there. They look like they're a good family. They can probably help me. And so he jumps out of the bush and he just, initially he scares Nausicaa and her friends, but immediately he starts speaking and he's so good with words. He's so persuasive. He's so powerful with his speech that he's able to immediately convince Nausicaa to be on his side and to be his ally and help him. And so, what does this show you? This shows you how persuasive he is. This shows you how intelligent he is, right? He uses his mind in every single situation, no matter how difficult or how challenging. And it shows his resilience, right? He just never gives up. He has his goal to go home, to survive, to thrive. And he's able to, again, weather these misfortunes and just use his powers and abilities to the best of his ability, to the best of his strength, to bring about a favorable outcome for himself. So that's just one example. Another important well, actually, another important concept that I want to go over is that of xenia, right? And that is a custom of hospitality in the ancient Greek world. It's the law and the custom of offering protection and hospitality to strangers. So one thing, as you read the Odyssey, you will notice how incredibly hospitable the ancient Greeks are, right? And so, at the beginning, when Odysseus goes to Phaeacia, nobody knows who he is. They don't know he's King Odysseus, a hero of the Trojan War, but he's treated just very, very well. Like, right? They hold a feast for him, they feed him, give him clothes, right? And so everywhere in the ancient Greek world, you're supposed to take in strangers, treat them well, give them hospitality because it's quite possible that the person who has come to your house might be a god or goddess. And there are several stories in the ancient Greek world where disaster has come down upon mortals because they were arrogant towards a stranger or didn't offer hospitality. And it turns out that the stranger was, say, like Zeus in disguise. And so in the ancient Greek world, again, that's why hospitality is so incredibly important. Of course, you can abuse hospitality like the suitors of Penelope who have been hanging out for many, many years, just eating up everything. That's clearly an abuse of hospitality and not okay. But in general, you're supposed to be hospitable towards strangers. Another literary device I want to talk over is that of the epithet, and this is one of the most powerful literary aspects of the Odyssey. So an epithet is an adjective or adjectival phrase that is habitually used to characterize a person or thing. So it's not just an adjective also, but it's an adjectival phrase or an adjective that's so powerful that you can almost use it in place of the thing. So for instance, in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare calls the pair of lovers star-crossed lovers. And this adjectival phrase, star-crossed, right? The adjective for, as for lovers. This adjectival phrase is so powerful that you can use it in place of Romeo and Juliet. If I say star-crossed lovers, you automatically think of Romeo and Juliet. So we find that all over the Odyssey. So one of some really powerful examples are rosy-fingered dawn, right? This adjectival phrase used to describe the break of dawn over the sea, right? Aurora, the goddess of dawn, waking up and bringing the whole world to light. We also have wine-dark sea, right? And so this adjectival phrase just giving you this image of this powerful dark sea that Odysseus must confront in order to get home. You have the man of many devices, right? Used to describe Odysseus himself. Again, this adjectival descriptive phrase that just describes his characteristics as a hero. I also want you to pay attention to similes in this particular epic poem, right? Similes are a simile is a comparison between two dissimilar things things using the words like or as. And so you have similes all over the Odyssey, and again, it's part of what contributes to the poetry and the cadence of the language. So when Athena visits Telemachus in Ithaca to try to get him to man up and, just go out and stop wailing his circumstances and go out, into the world to try to find news of his father and try to improve his situation. So after his visit, after her visit to him, she flew away like a bird, just again giving you the sense of her speed, her power, and the fact that she wants to alert Telemachus that this is divine inspiration, that he should go out and, you know, try to do something about the situation. We also have metaphors, which are comparisons between two dissimilar things, but without a like or as. And for instance, like again, going back to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, we have Juliet's beauty is the sun, right? And so it's a more direct way of making that comparison. Metaphors to some degree are less popular in the Odyssey than our similes, but we do have a few examples. So in the flashback scene, when Odysseus is telling the story of the Trojan War to the Phaeacians, he says, 9 years we wove a web of disaster for those Trojans, right? And then when he and his men are on the sea, right, sailing, um, he refers to the wind sent by Circe, right, to help him on his way as a welcome comrade. So again, a direct comparison between two dissimilar things without like or as. Something also that we should pay attention to is dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is when a reader or viewer knows something that the characters don't. So for the characters, it might be an unexpected outcome, but for the audience, it's not unexpected at all. And we'll find this in the when Odysseus comes home to Ithaca, when many people know that this is Odysseus, including Telemachus, including his nurse, but the suitors don't know. So a lot of those encounters and those interactions between the disguised Odysseus and the suitors are dramatic irony because those characters don't know what is going to happen to them, like the disaster that is about to befall them. But the readers know, right, what is going to happen. And that's the end of the presentation. So once again, I hope you enjoy reading the Odyssey. It's one of my favorite poems, right? I love Odysseus as a hero, and I'll see you next time.